Hey there, folks. Welcome to another episode of the Cracked Podcast, the podcast all about why being alive is more interesting than people think it is. My name is Alex Schmidt, and I'm the head of podcasting here at Cracked. I am also known as Schmitty the Clam, and I am also here to tell you about the most incredible heist you've probably never heard of. Let me play you the sound of that heist succeeding at this announcement event in 2010.
And this is the public notary of the city of Zurich. He gives me the envelope.
That is the voice of Sepp Blatter. Sepp was the president of soccer governing body FIFA, and he's speaking at a FIFA news conference / ABC's The Bachelor style reveal.
Ladies and gentlemen, I do hope that the name of the winner is on both sides, because I don't know. So the 2018 FIFA World Cup, 2018 FIFA World Cup, ladies and gentlemen, will be organized in Russia.
Okay, what was that noise? That was like a scream and a boo and also a trumpet section somehow. If they gave Bachelor Roses to that, I would watch that show. Like that's how you let the ladies know, you know what I mean? Or men, the Bachelorette, they do a lot. Either way, that was not the only announcement that day. They announced 2 World Cup host countries. Here's Sepp with the 2022 build-up.
Shall I recall the candidates? Australia, Japan, Korea, Qatar, United States of America.
And after he got done reading every country on Earth's names, Sepp ripped off the Band-Aid.
The winner to organize the 2022 FIFA World Cup is Qatar.
Yeah, more screaming and booing and tooting. That's what I look for. Also, I hope everybody looks at an event like that closely. It touched off investigations, scandals, allegations of bribery, and all kinds of other corruption you probably haven't even heard of, because the World Cup is happening this week, if you're listening to when this drops. And that is not just a sporting event, it's like a plotline from The Godfather, and most people don't even know it. Our topic this week is the World Cup's dark side, and whether or not you like soccer, this episode is for everybody. It's particularly for you if you live in the US, Canada, or Mexico, because in a couple of days they're going to announce whether or not your country is hosting the 2026 World Cup, so you should know what your tax dollars are going toward. But either way, soccer, in this case, is much bigger than sports. It is politics, it is how money moves around, and it is how one guy rented out most of Trump Tower for his cats. I know that sounds made up, we'll get into it. Because we're getting into a lot. We're going from soccer all the way to how sports can be used to prop up dictatorships, and my key guest for that is Dr. Natalie Cook. She is an associate professor and O'Hanley faculty scholar in the Department of Geography at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Go Orange! And she is a scholar who is diving deep into how sports and politics and Central Asia all collide in really strange ways, and some of those ways in history and today prop up dictatorships. My other guest today is Demorge Brown. He joins me in LA, and you know him if you follow comedy and or podcasting. We are really lucky to have him from Harmontown, from Channel 101, from so many other things that lead to all of the entertainment you like. So what a pair of guests. I can't wait for you to hear them and hear us get into it. Let's do that now. Please sit back or lean forward and make some World Cup picks. There's actually a lot of exciting soccer going on, even with the U.S. out of it. Like Iceland's in for the first time, Panama's in for the first time, Belgium might just win it. Can you believe that? Little Belgium. How about them? Isn't that neat? Either way, enjoy this episode of the Cracked Podcast with Dr. Natalie Cook and Demorge Brown. I'll be back after we wrap up. Talk to you then. I don't know exactly where either of you are from originally, but like what led you to soccer? Because I feel like in America, it's sort of a subculture, if anything.
I'll be honest with you. I've never in my lifetime known a place where soccer wasn't at least on par with football and baseball, if not larger than football and baseball. That's from being younger all the way up. And I find that that's weird now. Like now I look at it and I think, geez, man, because we moved around a lot, but it just sort of happened every place that we went. Soccer was a big deal. So I started playing when I was 6 just because I got to a school where on the first day at recess, that's what they played. And I didn't realize you're supposed to shoot and score. I just took the ball and nobody could get away from me. And then it just went from there.
Oh, right on.
Yeah.
So you were just like steeped in it. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved it. I mean, in New York, there were 900 channels even before you got cable. And each one of them, there were a lot of, like the Italian channel, which showed soccer all weekend long.
Natalie, how about you? Like, I know you're not just studying soccer or something, but when did the sport first come into your life in general?
I largely have started studying sport because I was doing my dissertation research on Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan has this bike team that's named for the capital of the country, which was the topic of my dissertation research. So I kind of fell into it, doing some research on that eventually because I, as a cyclist, was just curious about what was going on. And then because I study all the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, the World Cup going to Russia was pretty significant. But I've also been working in the Gulf countries in Doha for the last 6 years about. So I've been watching Doha transform itself since it was announced that they got the rights to host. So it's something that I've just kind of been slowly following.
I wish I knew more about Kazakhstan in general. I feel like the movie Borat is the primary touchstone of pop culture.
I want to know what the name of the team was.
Yeah.
See if I recognize that team name.
Team Astana?
That's a Kazakhstan team?
Yeah, so it was initially funded by the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Kazakhstan. Samrat Kazanov is the name of it. And now it's funded by a range of different entities within Kazakhstan. But yeah, Lance Armstrong rode for them for 1 year. Yeah. Alberto Contador rode for them several years. So it happened that Alberto Contador won the Tour de France the year that I was there doing dissertation research. And so I started to hear a lot of people talking about how we, as in Kazakhstan, won the Tour de France, which, the Tour doesn't work that way. Right. It's not organized. It's not organized around national team. But that sort of disjuncture between how these ordinary people were talking about it as if they had won and as if their national team had won when it's actually not. It's a corporate sponsored, but sponsored by their oil money that the government has decided to dump into that team.
I wish that history was communicated in the broadcast for the race. They kind of just throw these names out and don't let you know that there's disparate origins for all these sort of team names.
Yeah, I mean, and the Gulf countries have been getting in on these bike teams as well. So Bahrain and the UAE now also have bike teams that are named for themselves. And in most of these cases, they're coming from the sovereign wealth fund. So where all the oil and gas money gets pooled into these big funds, and why they choose bike racing, I don't know. There's some dubious motives.
For the U.S., is U.S. Postal the closest we ever came to that sort of thing?
Probably. Yeah, probably. We know how well that ended.
We know why it started too.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that's remarkable about Lance Armstrong. His downfall was the U.S. investigators really were only looking into this because it was when he was riding for U.S. Postal that a lot of this corruption was happening. So if it was just any other corporate team, maybe there would not have been such an interest on behalf of the U.S. government to take action.
It sort of relates to, because we're talking about the World Cup, but also a lot of world sports in general, especially this kind of thing with cycling and the Olympics. And it seems like corruption kind of follows it wherever it goes. And I feel like most, especially Americans, don't know that FIFA, the governing body organizing all these World Cups, it's been around since 1904. It took a turn starting in the 70s or so, and it's become this like crazy It's like a white collar criminal organization almost. It's really, really strange.
That's a beast now, from what I can understand.
Yeah, I was reading about it. Apparently in 1974, FIFA headquarters in Zurich, Switzerland had 12 employees total. That was the entire group. And today its revenue in a 4-year cycle is $5.7 billion of TV money and sponsorship money and everything else.
So 1974, that was the big transition when you had Stanley Rouse, who was the FIFA president. He stepped down, or was not reelected as the FIFA president, and you had João Havelange take over, and he was the one that really pushed getting the games and the World Cup on TV. So that was the big transition moment. In fact, I think what you were talking about, how like it's become something of a white collar criminal situation. I think at its origins, it was always kind of an old boys club and really sketchy networks. But what happened then in '74 was that the money and the resources that they were working with just blew up. And so, then that just sort of exaggerates what perhaps were already certain patterns.
And this was the first World Cup that sort of ABC got into. ABC was like, okay, now we have something we can show America on Wide World Sports. And because there was not this expectation for live broadcast, they would grab it, serialize it, and then every Saturday keep you updated and through the news sort of update you. And that's when that pattern started, and they were drawing advertising, and they would make these narratives out of things. But the big narrative out of that particular World Cup is that this Clockwork Orange team with Cruyff and Naskins and all these guys looked unbelievable, unstoppable, and they wore these electric orange jerseys.
And still do.
But I think Germany '74, suddenly Adidas goes crazy after that, because they have there was all this sort of merchandising that was just their jersey, the ball with '74 and the Adidas logo on it. Adidas attached themselves to the German national team, even though they were making the ball for the whole World Cup in all countries. And it just sort of starts spinning out there. Adidas cleats become a big one. Beckenbauer's cleat was Franz Beckenbauer, who was sort of the field marshal for that team, who then left and went to the Cosmos and went on to – see, this is the thing that's crazy. So that's 74, right?
Yeah.
But the Cosmos come in, and they're in New York. They're playing in the United States, which, like you said, at that time, largely a lot of people weren't really focused on soccer, especially as a broadcast event. But somehow they were filling up stadiums. They were drawing 70,000, and among those – celebrities, like Studio 54 celebrities, like Grace Jones and Mick Jagger were coming to watch soccer.
Right.
And it just became this weird cross-pollination that exploded. Suddenly they realized, if we go to the U.S., even though our career would be done, we have 3-4 more years, and we're getting world fame, and we're putting our name on training camps, more products, goalkeeping gloves, that kind of thing.
Not everybody who listens to the show is a sports fan, so they may not follow all the exact particulars of all that, but I think it speaks to, like, if you're into soccer, there can be these rivalries and lineages and things that go back so many decades. And, like, there are people in Brazil who are still heartbroken over games from the 1950s that they lost. Like, it's still
I
a thing.
All of it, and really the whole history of the sport, especially now that it's being serialized and people as a general whole are more receptive to it. I mean, now suddenly the number of ads with soccer moms in them, and I don't even – this is the next level of it. The number of ads with soccer teams, soccer players in them that are just general Sunny Delight ads or something, but it's clear that they've hired an expert to be on set to say that shot wouldn't go like that. You would never take that shot, or no bicycle kick in the shot, because every commercial has a bicycle kick in it. It's better to do a roundhouse, do a different type of kick, that kind of thing.
It's like a backflip if people don't know.
One of my favorites, because I fly Qatar Airways a fair bit, is that they've got the teams doing the air safety announcement, like the video. You have to watch the whole football team doing it. They're trying to get your attention.
They're probably experts in aeronautics. They probably know a lot about
exactly.
For an international audience, at least the kids will pay attention.
And that's such a thing, because as you both described, like, sponsorship is so much of a part of it, and also there's so much passion. Like, it creates a lot of energy and a lot of attention that builds this, like, pot of money. And Natalie, as you were saying, like, it has always been an old boys club, it sounds like, but that election that moved it to Havelange that when you say election, that's not like a democratic election, right? Like that's
Well,
a corporate board kind of election.
It's
kind
a
of-
close
yeah,
nomination.
it's
Yeah.
the representatives from the various groups
Yeah.
around the world. So yeah, I mean, I think that election is interesting as well because Adidas had a really close, like the Adidas rep, I can't remember his name right now. He had a really close relationship with Stanley Rouse, and so he sort of was giving Stanley Rouse confidence that he was going to win that vote. But then
Right.
when João Havelange took over, like that rep decided, okay, we have a new president. Adidas is all on board with partnering with him. So that didn't sort of jeopardize their role as the key sponsor at that point in time as well.
He has been sort of an August figure in FIFA for all of these years. Like in 2013, he had to step down from an honorary post he was holding at the age of 97 because it came out that he had taken bribes for TV right stuff in the 90s. And so at 97, they got him,
The current
Right.
face of corruption in FIFA.
Yeah, it's an organization that it seems like it's basically been run by a couple people. Like we have Stanley Rouse and a few people before him where it's an old boys club that's also not handling that much money yet. And then we have in the 70s, there start to be TV rights for it. And then people are able to just take money under the table to sell the TV rights out. And only a couple people have run it. Havelange, and then, as you just mentioned, Sepp Blatter is like the next guy.
Somehow kept getting elected.
And
Yeah, well, I mean, he also, so Sepp Blatter was Havelange's right-hand man for many years. So it was pretty, like, even, though he had a long tenure, he was in long before that.
And so this very, very small group of people, in 2010, they decided that these next two World Cups, the one this year in 2018 would be in Russia, in 2022 it would be in Qatar. And then after that, there was a raid in 2015, and then this whole investigation happening that we should get into, because there was a sting at a Swiss hotel, and they led 7 people out of it. And the hotel staff were holding up bed sheets to kind of protect the privacy of the people caught from the reporters.
There was a rep from Trinidad, and he sent his assistant, who was new or something, to this meeting in the hotel. And the guy gets there, and it's just a bunch of people on the stairs. And they keep telling this guy, he keeps asking, they're like, shut up, just shut up, wait for your turn. And
Right.
suppose he gets in the room, and there's just an envelope on the bed, and nobody will talk to him, and he doesn't know what's going on. And he opens it up, and there's money, and then he calls in. He goes over his boss's head and calls in, and this is where it all sort of starts to unravel, because that guy's
Yeah.
like, dude, shut up. And then somehow that information gets out. I don't know that that's true or legend. And there's trouble around the Qatar bid, too.
100%.
Because the first questions were asked were, A, how did you pass over these other amazing presentations? And then secondly, how are you going to have that World Cup in the summer? And then their response
Right.
was, we've got a plan. We'll show it to you later. So they were given a moment of time to show it. One of their things was they had a Dutch company come up with a series of large rugs that would be stadium sized. There were
Yeah.
animations that ran through this, and they presented this to people. Yeah, that's what we were talking about.
With
Yeah.
the Qatar bid, people were worried about the climate. It's just too hot in that country in the summer to maybe play soccer intensely, safely outdoors. They were like, what do
and
we
for
do?
fans to sit there and watch it and go up and down emotionally and drink,
Right.
and all that kind of
So
stuff.
they wanted to put rugs over the stadium.
In each section have them. Well, they said in the homes, a lot of the cooling system is done by these rugs that, in certain parts of the day, you can pull down on them and it's effective and it works. So they sort of blew that up, extrapolated for the size of a stadium, and had this Dutch firm come up with this thing. People who were sort of removed from that whole thing, who weren't just signing off on it, came back and said, "What are you talking about? Let's ask the Dutch guys." And they asked the architecture firm, and they were like, "Well, what we gave them was a sort of it was an idea. It was a proposal for an idea. It's not actually based in literal fact that can be pulled off."
Right, it's
That's
rug theory, it's not. Yeah.
But while all this is going on, I think the FIFA investigations are progressing and getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And then that's when they started proposing that they move the World Cup to the winter, and that all national teams that had pro schedules would take a break in the middle of the year or at the end of the year for some reason, so that the Qatar World Cup could be played in a cooler climate.
And I think that's how they're executing it. They're going to play the World Cup's always in the summer, but in 2022, it's going to be a wintertime cup because the weather will be more reasonable.
It's scheduled right now to start November 21st, 2022, and run through December 18th, which is also Qatar's national day. It's like their Independence Day.
Is that why in the first leak out of there's always a FIFA meeting before the World Cup where they award new things and that kind of stuff and celebrate the fact that they've made a gazillion dollars that year. And it feels like the first announcement that came out of it was that the English League leaked out that they were going to start taking a winter break. Which is an idea that had no footage for so long, and then suddenly today we are prepared to start taking a winter break, either next year or the year after or something.
If you're an American and listening at home and not a soccer fan, this is like if somebody said to you, "Hey, the Super Bowl in a few years is going to be on the 4th of July." Just because the world decided it needs to be. Also, there's probably some bribery behind the scenes that made it happen. Just roll with that.
And the bid, they originally did propose keeping it in July, which is what it typically is. Qatar did this also. They hosted the World Road Cycling Championships in 2016, which I went and did a project on, and they did the same thing. They moved it much later in the year than they normally would. It was still ungodly hot in October when they had it, and the cyclists did terribly with the heat. But nonetheless, it's something that they've pulled off before.
Natalie, you say you've spent a lot of time in Doha and Qatar. Like how bad is that summer? I've read, I think it's in the triple digits and then some, but I don't really know.
Yeah, it's pretty awful. So, and I say that being from Arizona, right? I'm from Tucson, where I'm accustomed to walking around in 110, 115, whatever it is. So yeah, it is. It is also worse because it's extremely humid. So there's, that's another big issue where it's just hard to cope with being out in the sun and the humidity. And some of the stadiums that they're planning to build are allegedly going to be having air conditioning. So that's one of the ways that they're trying to push back against this. But then, of course, I mean, some of my other research is about how they're trying to make these games look green and sustainable when like talking about one of the leading countries in terms of its water use and energy use per capita. It's just extraordinary. So one of the critiques that they've been subject to is saying basically like this is just a huge environmental wastage to do this. So they're trying to come up with all sorts of ways to say, oh, look, but we're going to power these air-conditioned stadiums with sustainable energy. However you can imagine that looking. It's totally absurd to have this in the first place, but at least we can make it green.
All that's astounding. And then FIFA awards these two bids at once in 2010. They're like Russia, then Qatar after that. And FIFA want us all to believe like we want to put these cups in Russia and in we're going to fully air condition Qatar because that's a good idea. We just think it's a good idea. And then it came out after that how FIFA works is there is a vote among members to decide things like this. Before the vote, 2 members were kicked out of it because they were like, these members might, be near money. And then it turned out basically every other member was near money. There was a lot of cash flying around, and there was one payment of $10 million to Jack Warner, who I think is maybe the Trinidad official you're talking about before Demarche.
Absolutely.
And then also a guy named Chuck Blazer, who's a phenomenal character. We'll get into that. But $10 million went to them. Also, a lot of the payments involved U.S. banks, and so this became like a U.S. federal criminal case that was tried in New York City court because there's a lot of reporting and a lot of bribery basically indicating that it's not exactly clear how Russia got a cup, but Qatar almost definitely paid some money to get a cup, even though it is like physically, ecologically, geographically not a thing that makes sense. Doesn't work.
A lot of the information that apparently the U.S. prosecutors got comes from Chuck Blazer being an informant for the FBI. So, if this happened for an extended period of time, he was collecting evidence for them, former CONCACAF.
It sounds like you're talking about Whitey Bulger, and it's like, but this is
Yeah.
soccer. This is how incredible this whole concept of a game and the size of its impact or footprint is. Because
It's astounding.
Well, there's a thing. Is this the same investigation then where they sort of started looking into the finances of Sepp Blatter and found that he had a penthouse apartment in one of Trump's buildings where he never went, but had a staff on 24 hours, and there was a cat that lived there, and that was it?
Blazer.
No, that's
Blazer.
Blazer.
Yeah.
Good God.
So it really is like soccer. I feel like if Americans have any general perception of it, if they're not fans, they're like, oh, it's a relatively gentle sport that the Europeans enjoy, But it's actually like that is somewhat true, but then the organization around it is like cartoonishly corrupt. And this guy, Chuck Blazer, was an American executive involved in FIFA, and he was paying himself $9.6 million over 5 years on top of his salary. He also set up a thing where any deal that CONCACAF makes, and CONCACAF is the overall federation for all of North American soccer, the entire continent, any deal they make, he got 10%, just straight up. And then he was renting an entire floor of Trump Tower, including one apartment that he just used for his cats. They just lived there.
And he was never there.
It sounds like I'm making all of that up, but it's a thing that World Soccer was paying for.
This is the thing that kind of gets me raising my eyebrows about all of the chastising of Qatar or of Russia or any of these places, is that it somehow just descends into this critique of those countries and somehow shifts the attention away from the very fact that, like, this is happening right here in the United States. This is pretty typical, right? Like, they're different issues, but
And I felt also the same way with respect to with Brazil when they were going through their build-up stage to the World Cup, because there were all these impact problems. Stadiums were running into construction issues. Then there were workers who were being underpaid, who then were going on strike to leverage better wages so that they could continue saying, look, we know you have a deadline. We're just not going to work until you guys realize it and then start paying us what we need, protecting us. Then transportation got involved. Then the people generally got involved around these saying, what are we going to do with these things when they're done, and where's all this money coming from? And the government themselves saying, look, we're doing this, we're allocating this as we have funds, we're doing the best we can do to distribute it. Meanwhile, FIFA's got these people running around wasting money on
cat apartments.
Pet houses for cats and that they're not using. And salaries on top of salaries, also turning their nose up saying, well, Brazil, get your act together. They always do this. If there's criticism of, they dangle out the alternative places, and the U.S. is always in there. U.S. and Sweden are always in there. Those guys are ready to go in case of an emergency.
When a country hosts the World Cup, their team automatically gets to be in it. There are a lot of reasons we'll get into why countries want to do these, especially with things Natalie has been researching. But also, there is some national pride element, and it seems like maybe that plays into we're like you said, we've been picking on Russia and Qatar maybe a little bit, but if you go back through some of these other cups, like 2014 in Brazil, Demores, you were talking about these stadiums that they were just struggling to build, and as of 2017, 6 out of the 12 they built are under bribery and corruption investigations for like various specific local building issues. With the 2010 Cup in South Africa, if people remember the vuvuzela horns and stuff, oh, very fun. At the same time, the BBC reports that there was a $10 million bribe worked out probably to get the cup put there between South Africa's president and Sepp Blatter. 2006 in Germany, the CEO of Adidas had a slush fund to try to get use over $6 million worth of money to push the cup toward being in Germany. And in the 1998 France World Cup, our friend Chuck Blazer says that he knew guys who were taking bribes from Morocco to try to put the cup there. There's all this pushing to get the cup. Like, is it just national pride? Is it just like we'll have an angle on this thing and we'll get to feel like we're part of it?
Yeah, I think that's a large part of it, but I think also there is that too. If it's in your backyard, everybody's watching you.
I would definitely say that that's at least how they sell it to the people. So one of the things that I really focus on in my research on these particular events, and there's tons of research about mega events all over the world. I study authoritarianism, like that's kind of my general topic. So what I'm interested in then is how and why are we starting to see the rise of these sorts of events in authoritarian states? And so those authoritarian states, a lot of them, they want to try and promote a positive image of the government to the people. And in some cases, they're more successful than others. But those states that are really keen on promoting this positive image, doing something like a big sporting event as a way to put a positive spin on a regime that is otherwise quite brutal, or suppresses all sorts of other expressions of freedom, whatever that may look like in a particular context. So they try and sell it to the population in that way, right? But like all these other sort of networks that we see, whether it happens in an authoritarian state or a democratic state, a lot of this is about just those elites with their hands in the cookie jar and pretty interested in trying to get that money or political connections, whatever it is that comes with hosting an event. So for a mayor of a city or a leader of an entire country like Putin in Russia, they definitely are interested in, and those people around them are interested in the money and the financial rewards that come out of this. So when we look at all these stadiums that are being built and the millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars getting dumped into them, and a lot of people always look at that and they say, like, what's the use? The people are never going to get all of their money back and they're never going to benefit from it at the end of the day. And of course they're not. The people that built it, they made a ton of money and they got what they bargained for, so, but they don't have any vested interest in it after they've built it because they got their paycheck.
One of the Russian stadiums is the most expensive stadium ever built. I don't know. I think it's not St. Petersburg, but it's one of those places.
Because I've read that they've spent $11 billion on stadiums for this World Cup, which feels like quite a few billions to me. And then they've also just done a Winter Olympics that was very expensive. And Natalie, you've done some great work on authoritarian autocrat leaders using sports as part of their persona. And like Putin's definitely one of the leading people of that, right? Like so many of us know him as a meme without a shirt on, like fishing and riding.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because we know him that way today, but he was definitely not the first to do that. Mussolini, for example, loved to have pictures of himself doing sports and also shirtless. So there's a whole series of photos of Mussolini doing shirtless sports, specifically skiing.
No way.
So yeah, no, a lot of authoritarian leaders that I have done some research on have used sports in this way for their own political sort of image building. But one thing that I also have noticed in my research on this topic is that it's not necessarily just about the leader. Like, it's not just about Putin. It's not just about him and his ego. And the same thing in Kazakhstan, the president there, Nazarbayev, he desperately wants the Olympics to come to Kazakhstan. And if anybody was paying attention for the most recent bidding process for the Winter Olympics, Kazakhstan and China were the last two standing. It eventually, went to China, but Kazakhstan's president is just like, he loves to be photographed doing sports as well. You can find him doing just about anything and everything. But the thing is that the people around him, all of those cronies, all of his elite sort of circle, they know the way to promotion, the way to get on the good side of the leader is to do anything that they can to get these big sporting events to come to them. So it's not like Putin or it's not like Nazarbayev or any of these guys are pointing a finger and saying, I want the Olympics, like, make it happen. A lot of the elites around them are coming together and saying, how do I secure my position here? How do I make sure that the president thinks fondly of me and makes sure that I stay in circle, because God forbid you get out, trying to and affecting that that possibility of having one of those big events is a good way to secure your position in those power circles. So that often sort of comes from the bottom up in a way, even though, it is all about the sort of personality cult and building up the image of the leader as the one who made this possible.
Because that's extra fascinating, because in the investigation of Russia and whether or not there was bribery to get the cup, they haven't found any super specific thing where like Putin bribed somebody or something, but it sounds like that wouldn't need to happen. It sounds like people under him would want to be on the up and up and take care of it for him without any direct orders.
Precisely. And you can apply that to basically anything with Russian politics, right? The elites around, they know what their job is. He doesn't need to say anything. And for him to say something, that puts him in jeopardy. So yeah, a lot of that just comes from those people in the circles around an authoritarian leader, that they know how to please him. At the same time, the idea of a personality cult, of a leader at the center, it's a fiction, right? Because the leader can't decide everything. Like, we want to talk about Putin as if he does all of these crazy things, and he's pretty nuts, but right. He can't do all of these things that people say he does. But the elites around him, they also benefit from that image that it's just Putin, because it keeps the attention away from them. And it sort of builds up this whole idea of the superhuman leader who can do anything and everything. And again, we come back to Mussolini. He was really good at that too.
Right. Real shirtless skiing. Support for today's show comes from our friends at Casper. Casper is a sleep brand that continues to revolutionize its line of products to create an exceptionally comfortable sleep experience one night at a time. With 3 mattress models, the original Casper, the Wave, and the Essential, Casper mattresses are perfectly designed to soothe and cradle your natural geometry. Not to mention, the breathable design helps you sleep cool and regulates your body temperature throughout the night, and it's delivered right to your door in a small, how do they do that, sized box with free shipping and returns in the US and Canada. But the best part is that you can be sure of your purchase with Casper's 100-night risk-free Sleep On It trial. After all, you spend 1/3 of your life sleeping, so you ought to be comfortable. And hey, I'm a comfortable fella. I don't know if you can tell from my voice or my demeanor, or if you've seen me around town lately, something like that. My Casper is a fantastic mattress. It's the best sleep I have ever gotten. It was very easy to set up, too. It just pops right out of the box. I've described it as being like science fiction technology before, and that's appropriate. It's fantastic. And I'm really appreciating being rested in a way that I didn't really think about before. And I think you can get that experience, too, by getting this kind of mattress. I think you ought to. It'd be nice. You know what else is nice? $50 towards select mattresses by visiting casper.com/cracked and using cracked at checkout. That's the promo code. That's casper.com/cracked. Offer code cracked for $50 off your mattress purchase. Terms and conditions apply. There's also this thing with soccer and the Olympics and cycling, and it goes into so many other sports that happen sort of internationally, because Natalie had picked out in your work Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan. I don't know if I pronounced any of that correctly.
That's pretty good.
But thank you. He was the leader of the United Arab Emirates, and also you've written about how he used falconry as a way to be a powerful leader and kind of set himself up in his country. Yeah,
so a lot of these leaders, as I was talking about, that are really keen to have themselves promoted as sportsmen, as athletes, each of them tends to have their own particular kind of sport that they might be interested in. So we see Putin doing all sorts of sort of mainstream sports. Chairman Mao of China, was famous for his swimming, and Sheikh Zayed loved falconry and really sort of held himself up as this great falconer. And it's a big part of Gulf identity is about falconry and promoting that sort of attachment to the homeland and love through this sort of sport that is attached to the Arabian Peninsula in particular. So, often it is about building that narrative about what a real sort of proper national identity looks like, and sports is a good way of doing that.
Sheikh Zayed, he was funding the buildup of falconry as like a sport in the country that people were into, right? It was there was like government resources going into his legend of loving birds.
Yeah, absolutely. So you see all across the UAE, you see a ton of different initiatives, but I mean, one of the most famous things is the Falcon Hospital in Abu Dhabi, which is fantastic. If anybody ever goes to Abu Dhabi, I think your number one stop should be the Falcon Hospital, because you can get a tour and you can get to see how they take care of these falcons. And it's these are birds that cost about $80,000 to $100,000, some of them, and so they go and they get their nails manicured or they get operated on if there's some bigger issue. It's pretty remarkable. But they also developed all sorts of conservation programs that they use to get a foothold in other countries. And so that's part of my research, is looking at how the Gulf countries, their elites are going and they're doing falcon hunting in other parts of the world. And Kazakhstan is one of the big destinations of that, as is Turkmenistan and some others. So a lot of the money that goes into these conservation programs then gets treated as aid, sort of development programs. Or in the case of Kazakhstan, people are allowed to hunt in the wild if they have demonstrated that they have contributed to some sort of local conservation efforts. So Qatar and the UAE have programs in Kazakhstan to sort of save the local wildlife populations. And this then opens the door for these elites from the Gulf to go and hunt, to do falconry there in the wild. So one of the things that's going to be interesting with the World Cup in Qatar is the fact that the country is under blockade from most of its regional neighbors right now, and has been since June of 2017. But a big piece of the story behind that is that there was a falconry hunting party that was kidnapped in Iraq, and there were like 24 hostages held. The Qatari government paid this huge ransom payment. Estimates are around $1 billion to all sorts of shady groups, including sort of terrorist organizations that were holding these falconers hostage. And that was one of the ways that Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who were kind of already agitated with Qatar and its involvement in international spheres, to point to that and say, look, this is Qatar funding terrorism. So the falconry stuff, it plays out in kind of odd ways, but it also means that back when those hostages were taken in December 2015, that those Gulf elites realized that it's not really safe to hunt in Iraq, and perhaps they should go somewhere else like Kazakhstan.
And the sport isn't just sports, it's also international diplomacy.
Exactly.
Largely when you hear people speaking counter to Putin, it's a journalist or it's a rebel from outside, or it's somebody doing something, and you know what happens to them. It seems that anyone who turns coat or says something that is sort of in the direct opposite direction of what the state is saying or what he seems to be saying. It's just public. It's public and it's clean, and and things happen. There at least seem to be some thread, some people willing to go out and do something. And as far as I can tell, I haven't seen anything in the way of a protest of this World Cup. And I wonder if, on the one hand, somebody is waiting for a larger stage, meaning the World Cup is in effect, and then something goes on, or on the ground level, there are more people who just want this to happen, and they're ready for the spectacle to happen. And I know that the people, from what I've heard, are so strongly behind this team, especially the lead player on that team is just super. He's pretty young. I think he's like 19.
On the
20.
Russian team.
Yeah. So this team has sort of been pushed to the people as this is your team, these are your players. And most of them play in the Russian league, and I wonder if that's part of why we haven't seen anything, and there really isn't any major sort of counter argument or protest that's going to come out of this.
I think Russians are extremely pragmatic. They know when it's worth their time and energy to stick up for what they believe in. And I think a lot of Russians are also extremely disenchanted. So my sense is that there's a mix of that sort of apathy there with actual national pride, right? And that's why these events are pretty popular among a number of these authoritarian leaders that have the funds to do it, because they recognize that they can pull on the heartstrings hearings and get people on their side, even when they might be like pretty vocal opponents of government policy in other realms. But that said, I also think that there's kind of a disenchantment after Sochi. So after all the sort of protests and everything that you saw mobilized around that particular event, even amongst the international community, Human Rights Watch has issued some reports and done some reporting themselves on a number of these this stadium human rights violations, et cetera, and a lot of the activism that they've been doing more recently has actually focused more on Russia's involvement in Syria. And that's interesting to me, the fact that Human Rights Watch is focusing more on Syria than on what's happening in domestic politics. It kind of says that, they recognize that what I think a lot of the media wants to just believe that transparency and revealing all of these violations is going to somehow just on its own result in some sort of change that doesn't really happen. And I think Sochi really illustrated that, right? Let's demonstrate all of these problems in Russia. Okay, we did that. And now what?
Yeah.
We still have the same thing 4 years later, right?
Yeah.
I think it's some disenchantment comes along with that.
Right.
But.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because especially in Russia's case, like between getting the World Cup and upcoming getting to do it, they invaded Crimea. They've been involved in Syria.
But also Ukraine's been very, very quiet.
Yeah, they've assassinated people. They've been basically kicked out of an entire Olympics for doping, but it doesn't stop them from getting to do the World Cup. They just get to still do this thing of, hey, be patriotic, my fellow Russians, because we have this young team with this great 19-year-old. Like, let's just get stoked about that, right?
Right.
It's like that Simpsons joke, let's just see him sock dingers. Let's just do it.
It's going to be interesting, too, because England, England's got to go there. And I think what they're hoping is that there's nothing that pushes that issue forward. That stuff happened on their territory.
Because of the assassination in the UK.
Absolutely. Which is the second one that we know of public, in the last, say, 8 years or so.
Yeah.
You've got that. And some other sort of satellite issues that if somebody wanted to make a move, this is the stage to do it, whether it's peaceful or otherwise. But
one of the biggest things that is a risk for Russia's sort of pride is that I suspect a lot of the stadiums are not going to be very full. And that's going to be an embarrassment if they're not overly full. And you're asking spectators to travel huge distances, mostly by air. And Russia is not an easy country to get around. It's just going to be logistically challenging for spectators. So I think that just Russians themselves, based on their history of being part of the Soviet Union and in many cases being forced to attend certain events, notably still happens in Turkmenistan, by the way. The government tells you you have to go watch this horse race. And people are all carted off to the stadium. They have to sit there, right? So that was a pretty common thing in the Soviet times. And so a lot of citizens who used to have that sort of experience, they have no interest in being told go to these games. And in Kazakhstan also, they give away free tickets. They try and convince the people to go, and nobody goes.
Maybe
that's their
actors.
Way of resisting. Yeah.
Just go hire some actors and train them.
The Qataris have done this. I am not kidding you. So they literally hire some of these expat workers, give them a dish dasha and the male headdress, and they tell them to go sit in the stadium so that they are full. They have already been working on this. So if Qatar's attendance is low, they know who the actors are, and they've got the wardrobe on hand to make sure that those stadiums look full.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it, Dishdasha. So are they taking these people and making them dress up as what would be like a stereotypical Qatari person?
Like a golf golf national dress.
I know that the largest stadium is over 90,000 in capacity
In Russia?
I think, yeah. And then a capacity of, if I'm right, of most of them on average is somewhere around 45.
The World Cup and totalitarians both love building stadiums that don't make sense. Like I would completely believe that it's going to be hard to get to games in Russia because that just like happens with these cups. In Brazil, they built a stadium in Manaus that seats 45,000 people, and Manaus is in pretty much the middle of the Amazon rainforest. It's a city.
Yeah.
I don't mean to make fun of it or something, but it doesn't really support.
But then the municipality
thing.
has to take it over, right? So that's the big thing that then hits the people pretty hard.
Absolutely.
But this is what I was saying before about how these people that are behind the bids and behind this, the political and financial elites, specifically in authoritarian states and specifically ones that have large oil and gas reserves or other sort of natural resources, money that the government has pretty easy control over, they're able to sort of delegate these big construction contracts to their friends, and that's precisely what happens. So those people have made their money. They've cashed out. They have, they don't have any stake in what happens to it afterwards. What do they care? So, I think this is why I think we're going to continue to see more and more of these events going to authoritarian states, unless, the international governing bodies sort of change course and are more conscientious about this, which it looks like they might be. But if this sort of pattern continues, you're not going to have the sort of opposition that you saw to Boston's bid for the Olympics, for example, right. Like in democratic states where people say, no, we're not going to foot that bill. Forget that. Whereas, in authoritarian states, the people don't have any way of protesting that. And it's the people that are at the top then that get to decide, okay, yeah, we'll choose Kaliningrad for a venue for the World Cup, right? I don't want to see that though.
I wonder if you saw any similarities in the actual U.S. World Cup, which I did attend in Massachusetts. I went to a couple of matches.
When you say U.S. World Cup, like in 94?
94? Was it the 94 World Cup? And I just wonder if you found any similarities in this sort of bidding war that went on that allowed the U.S. to get that. I mean, they certainly, I think they called in Uberoth as a consultant on it, and they weren't going to let that fail as a presentation device. But I wonder how they got it, and if you saw anything or have any info on.
Yeah, I actually haven't really looked at the U.S. World Cup, but I can certainly say there's huge similarities with what you saw happening with Montreal's hosting of the Olympics. So the big stadium that they built there, I mean, it was supposed to be a couple $100 million. I'm going to just say Canadian. It got up to almost $1 billion. The city only finished paying off its loans for hosting the Olympics in the 1970s. 76. About, I want to say in 2013 or 2014, they completely blew through the budget and had all sorts of corruption around that particular stadium deal. And again, it's a sort of financial political elites who are friends helping friends, right? So I don't think there's too much that we can say is unique about these authoritarian states. But what I do think is unique is that you just are starting to get enough popular awareness in the United States now and in other places around the world about this being such a big problem, and people pushing back, like the opposition to Boston hosting. There was just huge uproar in Boston saying, no, we're not going to do this. And in authoritarian states, when they close that opportunity down, then you're that popular sentiment can get steamrolled, or it just doesn't exist.
And it also, because it does seem worth saying that we're talking about a lot of totalitarian places, authoritarian places, managing to get the Olympics and the World Cup and getting to spend all this money on it. The U.S. is also in line for both of those things as a pair coming up pretty soon.
I think we'll hear about that in a couple of days, right? I think.
Yeah, apparently so it'll be after this comes out, people will find out the day before the World Cup starts this year who gets the 2026 World Cup, and the bids are either Morocco or a joint U.S., Mexico, Canada bid that's mostly the U.S. But if that happens, it'll be within a 2-year period, a Los Angeles Summer Olympics and a U.S. World Cup. Should we be scared about that? A lot of the pitch for LA is that it already has the facilities for things.
A lot of the pitch for the U.S. is that they already have.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at, by the time that World Cup rolls around, they've just announced they're taking MLS from where it is now to 28 teams ultimately. And they just announced Cincinnati has one. They're building a stadium. It'll be ready in 3 years. So if you count the stadiums that are
For soccer specifically?
Venues that MLS has built, because in the bidding process, that's the big deal. You can use an existing one to start, but they want to know that you have a soccer-specific stadium in your area that you're constructing or in the process of constructing or well on. Every time that someone is named, if there is an issue, again, FIFA themselves go out and they do this. Maybe we lobby, hit that button, and say, "By the way, we're ready. In an emergency, we're ready." The Women's World Cup that the U.S. won against China, the one that sort of sparked the notoriety for the women's game and the women's team, it was an emergency bid. I forgot who wasn't able to go.
Oh,
but,
really?
Yeah, I think we got it just because somebody wasn't ready, and we said, "Look, pick one, pick a city."
Yeah,
We're
we have
good.
these NFL stadiums we can just kind of
Yeah. So I think that has to be part of any bid that we go in with, is that, there's a structure here already, and a travel structure as well.
It's not easy to travel in much of Russia. I mean, it's pretty streamlined for international travelers in major places like Petersburg and Moscow. But once you get to the fringes, it definitely gets a little bit harder. So I can imagine lots of bureaucratic headaches around that. But I can also imagine a lot of people just not bothering. Not feeling like it's really worth the hassle to get a visa to go, and it's expensive. It's a lot of work. So in some cases, Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan that had these sort of European games that they started in 2015, they tried to temporarily ease visa restrictions to just basically help get more visitors to come for these big events. But I'm not sure how well Russia is going to handle lots of international visitors for this particular event, especially in the further reaches where they're not necessarily accustomed to getting a ton of international travelers. I think that might be a little bit jarring.
I would sort of love it if there's one channel showing the World Cup games and then another channel showing just the chaos immediately outside the stadium. It's so fascinating that maybe there will be a few empty seats on TV, but we're not going to see any of that going on. And it may even be packaged as just well, you might have heard there's some stuff, but don't worry about it. And because that's FIFA's approach too, to labor in Qatar. There's a not great system where that is involves confiscating the passports of migrant workers and forcing them to work in crazy heat. These organizations are just doing this thing, and it's not known about because I think we want sports to be such a positive because we like it so much, right? That's what we're going for.
The important thing to keep in mind is precisely what you just mentioned is the selective vision of the television, right? These people that are behind the production, the media spectacle of getting that on your television, they are experts. So you might have a bunch of goons running the show on the ground, but the people that are behind the scenes doing all this media stuff, they are remarkably good at making stuff look good. And this was something I really observed in full force when I was in Qatar watching the World Cycling Championships, because it was completely empty. All of these race venues were just abandoned, and you could see a little bit of that. There was a limit to some extent of how much of the editing they could cut out the lack of spectators. But nonetheless, they're pretty good at focusing your attention on what they want, which is the positive, as you mentioned, because that's what a lot of people want to watch and see these sorts of things. And this is why, Human Rights Watch issued, I think it was just a couple of weeks ago, a PDF document that they call a reporter's guide or a journalist's guide for covering the World Cup. And so the idea here is to say, okay, we recognize that this is going to get a lot of attention from the journalists. So why don't we give you some guidelines about issues to touch on in terms of getting people's attention to get them to at least think about some of these other issues that are happening. That said, I do think that there's a lot, there are limits to that, right? Again, what I pointed out before is that we can't necessarily equate transparency and exposure of all these issues with substantive change. It feels really good to say shame on you. That makes you feel like a better person for recognizing that there's stuff going on, but it doesn't mean that you're going to go out and change the world and you're going to end the abusive kafala system in the Gulf, where you do have these migrant workers that have, in some cases, have their passports taken away. It's important to raise the attention, but it doesn't mean change unless we actually kind of build that conversation out beyond that.
You were talking about the ability of the broadcasters kind of expertly maneuver around half-filled stadiums and that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of that is also helped by the fact that broadcast of sports has moved in this more cinematic region. So suddenly close-ups of the bench, people's reactions on the bench, you can fill time with replays and slow motion replays and other angles of shots, and suddenly a shot that maybe in '74 you would have seen once or twice over the course of a match before they had to return to the larger picture. They'll make you relive it as long as you want to by showing you any number of angles, any number of new speed changes within camera and that kind of stuff, and call it analysis and that kind of stuff. And I also think, but also the same people. It seems to me, and I could be wrong about this because obviously I'm not in the middle of it, but it seems that they have a position to create narrative while the event is going, or it's to their benefit to create narrative while the event is hot. Even if they're not the network doing the main coverage, the highlights are hot. So we'll show you highlights here, highlights there, blah, 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 blah. Maybe a side story here and there about something that's very different or human interest or a political issue, but mostly for the next however many months afterward, even a year afterward to 2 years afterward, leading into the next one. Any research that is done, any journalistic findings that are found connecting human rights issues, issues with workers, et cetera, and where all these things sort of cross over, that kind of reportage can also draw as well, if not even better, when it exists as fallout. So months after the games, you say, well, we saw this and we heard this and this was great, but what about this, which is going on at the same time? Or here's something you didn't know, and on and on.
That's a really good point. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons I like teaching about sport as well. So I teach about sport in my urban geography classes and political geography classes and authoritarian class that I teach. This is something that even if the students aren't necessarily sort of keyed into what's happening in Russia, they've at least watched the World Cup this summer, and then when we come back to class in the fall, they'll have lots and lots of questions about Russia. So I think you're exactly right that does kind of inject it into the popular consciousness, and then you can kind of pull back and say, all right, let's digest what happened.
Yeah, like it's almost an accidental awareness tool of these things that are going on. Because sports is so like it just, I feel like politics just bleeds into it no matter what, right? Like occasionally it's really, really pointed, like looking back at Mussolini, he made a point of building up Italian soccer. In the 1938 World Cup, they had the Italian soccer team wearing black shirts at one point, like Mussolini's street guys, and doing the salute, and they were doing it in France that they were about to go to war with. Like there's that really, really pointed thing, but then there's all kinds of other bleed over with all these other side things too. It's fascinating.
And on the flip side, I think it's interesting that you look at the history of Germany after World War II, when they were thinking about sports as a way to promote national pride and nation building, that sports was a really important way of bringing the country together after World War II, because you don't have like the institution of the state to be proud of, right? We just got rid of the Nazi regime. So sports was kind of unifying in that sense. So it can be played both ways. And I think that's what's so fascinating about it, is that it has so much positive potential as much as it does have the negative.
See, that's the thing. That's I mean, I know that we've had this focus this time, but that's the stuff, man.
Folks, folks, that is the episode for this week. My thanks to Demorge Brown and Dr. Natalie Cook for sharing their lived experiences with soccer and cycling and falconry and dictatorships. Extra thank you to Dr. Cook for calling in between trips to Doha and to Helsinki. And thank you to Demorge for limping into that taping with a fresh injury from, that's right, playing soccer. Our guests are legit. And hey, you are legit too. Did you know that? You should know that. And you deserve the very best. Footnotes? You get them this week. There's tons on those investigations and bribes and scandals and Chuck Blazer. I'm still not over that guy's name, you know? Isn't that neat? Chuck Blazer? It sounds like a name for the guy driving the Knight Rider car. I don't know why. Also, we'll get into tons of past and present dictators doing sports stuff. You can see it there. And along with all that, dive into Dr. Cook's website to know all kinds of things about what she's studying and publications that are coming out soon that I think are really neat and all about this kind of thing. Also, a couple soccer things to kind of clarify, kind of confirm. At one point, Demorge mentioned that a Women's World Cup moved countries at the last minute, whole different host country, and that happened. 2003 Women's Cup went from China to the US in an emergency situation, partly due to a SARS outbreak in China. And at one point I mentioned offhand that Brazil is not over defeats from the 1950s. I'm talking about one single defeat in the year 1950. We're linking a piece about how that has scarred the Brazilian psyche for almost half a century. You know what? More than half a century, because that's how math works. Also, some of you might be wondering, like, hey, why isn't the US in the World Cup? That's the most relevant to me. Well, we're linking an exhaustive piece from The Ringer about how that team lost enough qualifying matches to not be in the Cup this time around, but who knows, maybe we'll host it in 2026 and get that automatic bid, baby. And what else do I have to tell you beyond that? An enormous thank you to everyone who came to our live podcast this past weekend. You had great stories and a lot of just fun hanging out with us. We'll get that episode in the feed in the next few weeks, and I'm very excited about that. Also, thank you to everybody who came to my TV pilot script table read. That was just very, very, very nice. And y'all were also very thoughtful about how a piece of writing works, which takes a lot of mental energy, and that's very, very, very cool of you. So thank you. But enough about this weekend. Let's talk about this episode. Our theme music is Chicago Falcon by the Budos Band. Our episode was engineered by Ryan Connor and edited by Chris Souza. If you loved this episode, that's great. If you hated it, let me know about it on social media. That's right, social media, a place where you can be sure to let me know how dumb I was for saying Belgium might win it all this time around. 'Cause, like, come on, Al, Brazil exists, you dummy. They're huge, they're great. You know what else exists? My Twitter account, @AlexSchmitty. I'm also on the wider internet at my website, alexschmitty.com. Also, you know, what if I was right about Belgium? Let me know that too. That would be pretty cool, right? You know, look at them, cheering in Brussels and Bruges. Anyway, I'm happy to say we will be back next week with even more cracked podcasts. So how about that? Talk to you then.
This has been an Earwolf production, executive produced by Scott Ackerman, Chris Bannon, and Colin Anderson. For more information and content, visit earwolf.com.
I had this book, like, laughing at me from my bookshelf. Oh, smart boy, you can't read me. Well, I can read you, Jude the Obscure. I'm Michael Ian Black, and this is Obscure, in which I read Jude the Obscure out loud and comment on it as I go. There must be literally tens of people who will go with me on this journey. Subscribe to Obscure wherever you listen.